In today's little talk, I'd like to talk both practically and speculatively about how we can work in front of the microphone, behind it, and then working on into the editing process. Naturally, most of what I'm going to talk about is within the necessary constraints of how I work as a player-producer. However, I think it's worth saying, and I do think this is important, that for all the talk of adventure, there will always be a negotiation. You'll find with commercial industry expectations and standards. However much, as I hinted in the last talk, that there is often a divergence between the expectations and perceptions of what these might be or should be from both sides of the equation, the sort of them and us. Even if you choose to go it alone, to find a way of using recording and communicating it in a way which is to a greater or lesser degree released from these standards and expectations, it's important to be ready for the fact that you can't expect everyone to listen in the way that you do. That these normals are there in the listening public, and most of all in the critical reception to what you choose to do. In the latter case, it's also worth noting that you can't expect critics to step out of their comfort zone that much. They will always listen with 99% of the time as little regard as possible for what the artist might be up to, might be reaching for. It's a waste of time being upset by that. I mean, think of the number of times a Guardian film critic is sent to the new Disney picture and is upset by the fact it's not Tarkovsky or Agnieszka Holland. But for all that, I think I can say it's possible if you understand and work with the process from top to bottom, so not only produce work which satisfies you, but is interesting and exciting from all flavours of the recording industry. Speaking personally, the recordings which I make as player, producer, are and have been released by behemoths like Naxos, Independence in the UK, and Toccata and Métier, the US, Palmer, Innova, New Focus, Australia, Move Records, and radicals such as John Zorn's Tadzik, which only really releases things which John Zorn is interested in. Second of all, I want to say that controlling, understanding process enables you to keep ahead of what's going on moments and situations where you might not be the prime mover, not in control, not the person running it, and often will give you the tools to rescue situations where generic approaches break down. This happens very often, and so I'll come back to that. So let's get a little practical. The closer you get to recording, the more, in my opinion, your work at the practice desk should mirror and preempt how you're going to work in the studio. There is obviously a parallel here with the preparing for a concert, but I am often surprised how performers' practice of the studio is going to feel like be the concert platform. It never is. And if you're preparing for it as if it is, you will be closing down options and possibilities. Nearly all of these possibilities and options relate to how you listen. Now, this will necessarily overlap with some of what I said in the last talk, but I think it's worth saying at least twice. The question of listening might have a bearing on how you use pre-recordings to set yourself for a day's recording, or more than one day's recording. A lot of you, I can see, use a microphone in your practice, and I think it's fair enough to say that most of that microphone use, whether it's a phone or a mic like the one I'm using here, will be for the use of a second pair of ears, effectively, the equivalent of an artist holding up a mirror. I would say that the use of a microphone in the preparation for recording is different and should be different, both in more practical and abstract terms. I've learned a lot about this from Daniel Ben-Pinar, who right from the time we started talking about music making and recording, impressed upon me the usefulness and importance of rough pre-recordings for a whole range of reasons. Now, at one end, this speaks to timing, and the other, the sense of how the landscape of a disc fits together, its sense of proportion or of drama, which at its most obvious relates to the structures of the pieces that you're working internally. To clarify that, putting together a group of pieces on a recording, inevitably there's going to be a dialogue between the internal structures, whether there's sonata form or variation form or rondos, within the music itself, and the way the music groups itself so if you're making a CD or you're making a group of pieces. For my generation, this relates some ways to the old idea of the compilation tape, particularly what a compilation tape would be like or sound like when you're going to give it to somebody else, because in many ways that's what we're thinking about. You're making a recording, you want somebody or more than one person to have an experience which may or may not be related to listening to that sequentially. It's interesting that that has something which for a while slipped away, but I think that's coming back. There's a resurgence of the recital recording, and collections of works by different composers are more likely to be listened to sequentially than, say, if you record Beethoven sonatas, it's more likely that person is going to listen to the sonatas for the one they want to listen to, as opposed to listen from to beginning to end. Now, of course, Nick Hornby put this very well when he was talking about compilation tapes, and what he said is very useful when you're thinking about how to use pre-recording. This is from, of course, High Fidelity. The making of great compilation tape, like breaking up, is hard to do and takes ages longer than it might seem. You've got to kick off with a killer to grab attention. Then you've got to take it up a notch, but you don't want to blow things, so then you've got to cool it off a notch. There are a lot of rules. Of course, in today's climate, we're likely to talk about playlists. But if you think about how you organize and shuffle those, there's a good example there of how to use a rough recording, or give you an idea of the process of doing that. When you choose what to listen to, how to order it, will help you a great deal when you see the process of how a rough recording of material can find its way into a recording session. And the second question, the more practical one, is the question of timing. I've always talked about the importance for me of the timer on the practice desk and in the studio. But it's worth saying that making sure that you are recording, when you're recording, that you time things, really gives this process some strength. I learned the hard way years ago, recording a cycle of 24 pieces by Sazakui for violin and piano for the old Russian Olympia label. In all my frantic activity of sourcing music from all over Europe and rehearsing and giving informal performances and what have you, I assumed that 24 pieces of music, which did feel like a lot of work, would be a CD's worth. Just over 59 minutes is standard. So I did not time, and I did not record before we went into the studio. This was a big mistake. After 2 days of recording, we had just over 50 minutes of music. Luckily, the recording company agreed for me to have another day to record Quee's sonata. They even paid me. This would not be the case today. So it's a good idea to be practical. In my experience, the way that you record should mirror the way that you're going to edit as closely as possible. Everything that you do should be using the hope for the best, prepare for the worst scenario. This can apply both to time management and getting enough material. We all have horror stories pertaining to both. So, beginning with the way that you map something, I'm going to be a bit precise about this today. The way that you map out a session should preempt, and by now I'm actually talking the way you map how takes are recorded. This should preempt as much as possible the way that you're going to lay out an edit. Of course, this is going to involve grids and tables, and you can do this, on spreadsheets, or if you're me, you do it in a notebook. And I'm most happy doing these not on the phone or the computer, but I'm a pen, pencil, and paper person, and I want the bare minimum of electronics around me at any given time. The other thing that's worth saying is that I find it's much more convenient for me to be able to work with the same materials that I'm using to mark my parts up, which are pen and pencil. So effectively I can have the notebook and the music on the stand at the same time. Basically, the music stand becomes a desk with all my gear on it. Is often a bit of a joke when we do quartet recordings, and of course I'm sitting in the leader's chair and producing, and I make a sort of camp around me. There will be the stand for my music, and obviously then there will be another stand next to me for my notes, and then because I'm going to be able to put the violin down when I'm going to write notes, there has to be a place for the violin to go next to me. So it's a kind of little castle of activity. But going back to that mapping, it's really all about record keeping and planning. The first grid, which I usually make about 72 hours before recording, is the map of what I'm going to do. Here's an example. So this is just pertains to a disc of the Wilsmeyer 6 partitas of solo violin, which is in process at the moment. It's worth noting, as we've all experienced, that lockdown has challenged us to be efficient in these matters. I was supposed to have finished recording these pieces with 2 hefty days of recording in January and February. It's a pretty full disc. But the second day was wiped out by rain, and then lockdown hit. I wasn't able to get back into the venue until late in the summer to record the last sonata, which required using time budgeted for another recording. You don't get your money back if you hire a medieval church, if God decides that the land needs water. So I'm going to stick with some questions around that extended project, which we're just halfway through the editing process right now. So this is one page of planned segments with the take numbers written in. The number of takes in my case varies according to 2 aspects. One is the number of people involved in the recording, and 2, the number of hands on the editing process. Let's put this bluntly. If I'm working alone, I ask my engineer to open up a single take number for each segment I want to record, and I work on that segment until I have what I need. During that, I won't make any notes. If there was something important, I'll simply speak it into the microphone, because then it means I know I have it. If I have something I'm particularly concerned not to forget, I have asked my engineer to write it down on the take sheet that he's keeping. And I'll come back to that importance of this doubling up on materials. Now, if there are more people, there are various reasons for this. I tend to not do the open take system. The first reason is because if you need people to know where they are, and curiously, takes means that people have a sense of closure. If you have an open take, there's always this kind of feeling that whoever's producing is just going to keep you at it until you're there. Whereas curiously, the funny thing about the closed take is there's a sense of each one having a little finality to it, and then there will be a decision. But that decision-making process is kind of useful. The other thing is I also might need, when we're in editing, people to make a reference to a specific thing easily in the editing process, and that's easier to do if they can do it within a specific take. So whereas if I'm working myself, I can simply work through, because I listen to everything again and again and again after we've recorded. But if it's with other people, they can say it's 30 seconds into take 40 or whatever. That's very prosaic, of course. So as you practice, it's back to preparing, the way you break the music up or not will emerge if, as I suggested, you're practicing towards the recording. This means that your practice is very unlikely to be, particularly for a string player actually, towards a complete run through of something, particularly with the bigger movements, because that won't give you anything you can use. To state the obvious, miniatures such as movements of Baroque suites, such as this Wilsmeyer, work very well as matched takes and sections, both because of the scale and because binary ternary form maps very well onto the process of recording. Many of us will find ourselves rotating repeats until we're happy, which of course is much easier to do when you're by yourself. A bit of a word of warning here, and I did find this out the hard way. It is vital to ensure that if you're doing this rotation, that you have a sufficiency in every regard of final movements of last repeats and clean beginnings. For instance, if you're playing a Bach A-A-B-B presto, you will find that if you try and edit an opening from a repeated section, invariably there will be a hangover, a bass note or harmonic ringing into the space, which means there will be a tail of that last note in your first, which you can't use, or you'll be asking your engineer to start from a cold start, which most engineers absolutely loathe doing, because then they're going to have to juggle about with grabbing ambience and sticking it in front of that note to fix the problem of the effectively coming from black. So you do need to plan for this, and so when you're doing these rotating sections, you want to make sure that you're always giving enough beginnings and endings, and not just the linking passage when you choose to go across. that as a general rule is one fundamental rule of organizing everything, is to be really, really careful about the fact that when you make segments that, for instance, there is a clear break that you can use and there's not going to be a completely untenable link. Now, of course, what I'm talking about here is not any form of multi-track recording. I'm talking about the, if we can call it, pure classical recording of recording, so you only edit vertically. So you just cut straight down and you either do a crossfade or whatever. There is no, if you like, foxing of the thing. So your session map should, amongst other things, reflect this, and also allow you room to get stuck or obsessed or rotate on something. If I'm expecting to do a whole piece in, say, 10 segments, I want to find that, on the edit map, I want to find that I can do it in 6 or 7 in the studio. But then the literal room on the paper, so space I'm not using, gives me space to go in more detail if it's demanded. And it doesn't matter whether you're by yourself or whether you are working with others. There will always be an occasion in, say, a day of 7 to 9 hours recording, if it's a solo recording, that where either you'll run into a brick wall or you'll run into a brick room as a group, or there'll be somebody who will have a freak out. It's human nature, just as much as it's human nature that people tend to work on 45-minute concentration spans. Human nature means that you're going to have to allow for these possibilities, and that's something you need to think about when you're talking about how you allow timing to record things. There's also something to plan. That's also something to plan for. In generally, I only write the recording map on one page in the notebooks that I use, because this allows me to make notes, which is quite rare, on the opposite page, but that it also means that unexpected patches can be inserted on that clean page. Either if we find, for instance, there's just once in a while you'll find there's something which is perhaps almost impossible. For instance, an Edward Cowie quartet, an early quartet we're recording all of his quartets, had one passage in the first quartet, which is, for the whole quartet, which is basically impossible. It's great in a concert because it's a sort of forest fire kind of passage, but in recording there's no, you have to basically unpick it. We hadn't really realised that until it was a mistake, until we got to the recording, so we needed to break it up surgically, and that clean page was very useful for that. I know it's very prosaic, but it's a really kind of good note. A note to myself, I find as I go through a recording day, effectively getting deeper and deeper into the music, my handwriting deteriorates into a total scrawl. My ability to hear a take number and even write it down efficiently completely disappears. So it's very important for me to make sure that the way I record and lay things out won't be threatened by my incremental incoherence. So the crucial thing to remember in recording as well is backup. My engineer, like every good engineer, runs his own log sheets. These contain a very accurate list of takes, and most importantly, a record of the non-musical issues which may or may not arise. Often, if, for instance, I ask him to flag up a particular take as being good or very bad, he'll put that in as well. But what I'm really talking about is something on which I'm a broken record, which is, it's really vital to say, that you must have someone who's listening from a technical, I mean a tech point of view in recording. And in some ways, this is the hardest job, as you need that person to be constantly listening, not listening to music in some ways, but logging for extraneous noise, changes in ambience, which is really important when you're working small scale, and what I call kind of problems of the line on a line. One in every 4 to 5 recording sessions, there's going to be an issue with a cable or a connection. Particularly if you're setting up in the recording, you're setting up in places where it's not being recorded in regularly. The pressures of moving equipment around means that stuff gets jiggled around and there'll be problems. These mistakes will only be heard if they're actively being listened to. You want your engineer to be listening to sound, not just listening to music. It's also why I'm very suspicious of the engineer as producer. Engineer as producer, in my experience, means they are not fully giving attention to what we really need them to be. It's also, so it's a reason why it's really worth to train yourself to do it yourself, unless you can afford for them to be different people. It's also important to note that what is heard in the hall or the studio is not the same as what's heard in the box. And we do need to have a constant dialogue about this. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. An aside, if you're recording cycles of works, and of course this may simply be you're recording a multi-movement work, I find it important to, and it's another grid, to visualize the cycle on a piece of paper. And this may or may not have an impact on how you decide to record and what order you decide to record. And it's worth just playing with that idea. If you have, say, a cycle of 30 pieces, and if particularly if those 30 pieces are all of the same scale, and you don't want to have a sense of them being incremental, then you may choose, although it can be scary, you may choose to record in a different order. So recording the 30 tartini sonatas, I decided to record them in a weave because it was clear for me that Tartini had explored these sonatas and the manuscript over a 20-year period, and he was going back and weaving in. That was a good decision. Recording the Schubert 3 sonatas, I decided to do it, so I did the slow movements, then the minuets, then the last movement, and then the first movements. And that was a bad decision. It actually ended up that we were stressed in the wrong way. We should have done it in orders. You keep trying, you hope you're going to get it right, but then you don't. My way of laying out the map is in columns, so I just do left to right. So I have bar numbers on the left, the disc number, most engineers are still breaking up things into discs, and the real reason for this is how I choose to extract the material as we go and back up. So we punctuate today's recording with backing up what's been recorded onto a third and then a fourth a hard drive. And that's easier to do if you're breaking up into, say, maybe 2 hours at a time. Then these get labeled blank A, B, C. So take 1 will be on disc 1, take 1A will be disc 2, and so on and so on. As I've said, the number of takes depends to a degree on whether or not you're using the open take system I described or not. And if you're not, I would say that the average number of repetitions is going to be between 3 and 5. 3 is a bare minimum, allowing for the unexpected. But sticking in terms of numbers, the question of how many takes is, for me, simply a question of how much fun people are having. And of course, the question of time, which would not be in anyone's mind apart from yours, if the session is yours, if I can call it that. There's really no benefit to urgency. Too many professional recordings, especially orchestral ones, clearly give evidence in terms of the kind of ragged sound of players under pressure, or the clock ticking, or sometimes this can simply mean they're boring. One of the questions which is most important to a lot of you, and I'm using what you've been writing to me, is the question of sound. There were some really fascinating responses to this question when I asked, with people giving examples of particular sounds they liked, from Callas to Philip Glass to Jeff Buckley. Others of you gave almost surgical descriptions of the sound you wanted to hear or dreamt of. There are far too many to enumerate. Here's a striking example from Bryony. For me personally, the cello recordings I warm to most are those with focus on the lower strings in particular, less sharp or loud sound on the upper register of the instrument. I think it's what I would like to focus in my recordings, ensuring that the lower timbres of my particular instrument comes across as closely as if the listener was right next to me, if that makes sense. Now, I can think that a number of you might be thinking that, one, I'll be expecting the professionals, the producer or the engineer, to do that, and two, I really want to know how to do that myself. Now, these two things are not contradictory, so I hope you won't mind me talking about them sort of at the same time in order to answer some of the questions that a lot of you have about mic placement, or just to say, naturally, these are not practical sessions, so I'm a little bit limited to what I can share, but I can give you basic answers. The most important thing, and this does become easier, is to have a clear idea of maybe two things. The first is what the recording characteristics of your particular instrument are. In every case, sound comes out from any instrument in many and varying directions, and singers. and it gathers in certain places in the room. For instance, with the violins that I play, if I take a point halfway between the bridge and the fingerboard of my violin, imagine a line starting there, going up perpendicular to the table of the instrument. So that means angled about 4 or 5 degrees stage left. About 160 centimeters up, there is a sweet spot where ideally we center a pair of cross microphones. So that will be the center of their supporting bar. That's with, say, the Amati I normally use is where there's a good clear acoustic space and the sound is closest to the sound that is in my ear and the sound that I'm hearing. Now, a little sidebar here. I, like many colleagues, have had the experience of recording in usually airless and characterless studios, where the sound in the room has no relationship with the sound being mixed at the desk. Of course, if I was anything but a classical musician, this wouldn't be a problem. I would be playing or listening on headphones, which means that the dry studio is a moot point. That's not how I listen, and I want the sound in the room to be close to the sound recorded, and the sound recorded to be close to the sound in the room, and those sounds as close as possible to the sound in my imagination. It's a good idea, however, looping back to my remark about instruments, to get a really good idea of the colour and directional qualities of your own instrument. This can be of immense usefulness to an engineer, particularly if you're confronting them with a variety of different characters of instruments that you're playing on at any given time. So my engineer is very used to 3 of the instruments that I use, and the years that I was playing on the 1698 Joachim Strad, he noticed, for instance, the difference in between 2 recording sessions when I had the tiniest adjustment made to the bridge. Now, this, of course, is the ideal relationship that you're aiming for with an engineer as a collaborator, as a duo partner in some ways. But the downside of this, and this does link back to what I said, is sometimes an engineer you know very well will need a lot of guidance if you walk in with a different or differently set up instrument from what you're looking at. So, for instance, increasingly I've been doing more and more recordings on Baroque instruments or Baroque setup instruments, and the thing which interests me is the different characters of those. It's not a criticism, but my engineer is very interested in the sound which he's been working on, of what he would regard as being the kind of centre of my sound, and understanding that. And he finds it difficult sometimes. For instance, I walked in with Charles II, the 1664 violin, which has a very particular, almost toothy, nasal kind of sound, which is very much the sound of the 1660s in England. And for the first 5 or 6 minutes, my engineer was struggling a bit not to hear the sound, but to hear how I was hearing the sound. So it's not a disadvantage, but it means that when your engineer knows you very well as a player, they will always sometimes be hunting for that as opposed to something else. So here's an example of how you can experiment a bit, and this is linked to that thing I was just talking about listening to your instrument in different ways. When I was preparing to record a disc of 18th century solo music on the 1929 Girolamo Amati I normally play, I noticed that there was a very directional quality to the bass sounds of that instrument in that repertoire, which always also relied on a lot of low resultant tones. So I experimented with this, placing the violin, a small mic in different ways around the instrument, underneath, on the front, behind my head, on the floor, all of the kinds of things. Now, it doesn't matter what instrument you're doing this with or what quality of microphone you have, this is something which is really worth doing. So when I'd done that, and we came in to do the recording, and bear in mind this was with an instrument he did know very well, I discussed my experiments with my engineer, and he looked slightly more doubtful, and I said, well, look, why don't we put a third microphone under the instrument on the floor, literally pointing up, have it as a separate channel. We can lose it if we don't want it, but it's there if you want it. It's not making any acoustic difference. It's not producing any sound which is going to be picked up by the other mics. And what was interesting is that it did pick up the sounds we were looking for in the context of the actual impact that they had on the sound. Perhaps you could say that it was minimal impact, but with recording, of course, things which might seem to be of tiny, almost of no consequence, can have enormous results when it comes to the overall sound, both in terms of colour and in timing. It's very interesting to think about what Bryony said, that she wanted the listener to have an experience as closely as if the listener was right next to me. It's not surprising that a cellist would hope for that. And the cello is clearly an instrument which cellists get great pleasure from playing, being close to. I'm not really sure that we violinists have the same thing. But there is a trade-off. The more detail and timbre that you have from being close to instrument, the less shine and warmth. Think about it. The closer you are to a guitar, the more you're going to hear the fret noise. To a flute, the key clacks. To a breathing. And to a violin, well, I have first-hand experience of critics and a record company complaining about my mic setting for Tartini, which I'd worked on with my engineer, aiming to let the listener hear as many of the harmonics and partials that I hear close to the instrument, because it seemed to be important to Tartini. He'd written about it. And his entire theory of harmony mathematics came from that close listening, what you get with the ear literally a few centimetres from the belly of the instrument. I was made to put an explanation in subsequent discs as a cycle as to what I was doing. I'm not sure why I agreed to that, as both critics and my record company were upset with, guess what, the sound of the violin, the sound up close of the violin. That up close thing I'm going to come back to a little bit later with regard to a famous artist. Now, you will remember that in the first talk I talked about balance or balances. The artists are often forced to adopt between personal recordings and the kind of building a library style recordings. I think this is very much a similar question when it comes to sound. Do you have to or want to fit a standard model of sound? It could be Decca 1976 or Melodia 1963, which could come to mind as great examples of standard models which are in themselves wonderful. Or are you going to quest for something more adventurous, and your decision will impact your relationship with the industry? Now, Kenny wrote very interestingly about the excitement of two different relationships to the mic in piano recording. He wrote, with Glassworks, Philip Glass' first big kind of world smash album back in the 1980s, I like the combination of the out-of-tune upright piano and closely placed microphones to the extent that we can hear the pedalling. To me, it removes the sense of space, and the closeness to the instrument adds to a hypnotic effect. However, with the Richter recordings, I enjoy hearing him in full space and unedited, very much unlike the heavily modified sound of piano recordings, especially during the last 6 or 7 years. But there's another vital question to ask ourselves, and at the moment it's clear that there is no answer to it. Anna writes, recordings such as Heifetz's or even jazz ones keep the warmth and purity of the sound they were doing. There's something very special in the quality of these kind of records I think we've lost in the present with so much technology. I'm not sure I agree with we're losing because of so much technology. I think it's because so far we haven't learned how to use the technology to the best advantage. But in the case of both the examples Anna is citing, there's one crucial factor which we need to remember, and it presents us with an almost impossible challenge. The great recordings of Jascha Heifetz and his generation of jazz musicians, Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, Lena Horne, existed in a world where all music, whether it was live or recorded, was heard and expected to be heard in an acoustic space. So basically meaning that whenever you heard music on a record player, it would be set in the side of the room and the speakers or the horn would project that music out into the room itself. Now, what's particularly fascinating about Heifetz's recorded sound is that he pioneered a dry, under-the-air brilliance, which if you play it on big speakers in a full-size room, sounds golden as his sound did in the concert hall. Effectively what he was doing was he was planning for the way that he knew that most of his music was going to be listened to. and he produced something which functioned in that way as if he was playing in a concert hall. And the result was the experience of hearing him on stage, because everyone who heard him live said that his recorded sound had absolutely nothing to do with the sound of hearing him on stage. That dry, scratchy thing was not audible at a distance. Now, clearly, he knew what he was doing. But of course, particularly with a very analytical remastering of his recording, there's a tendency for this to be exaggerated. Now, here's where it gets difficult. The younger the listener today, the smaller the loudspeaker or whatever they're going to be listening onto. And so what do we do? How do we record? What do we aim for? And these conversations not only find their way into the editing suite and in the recording studio or hall as well. So, for instance, my recording engineer has an extraordinary setup, one half of the room set up with enormous speakers, valve preamps, what have you, which means the sound, and we sit a good distance back at very full volume, aiming to hear the whole range of the sound. And he always points out to me that even though the speakers I have at home are great, they're not as good as his speakers. And he is very suspicious about listening on headphones, which I barely ever listen to on headphones at all. I don't really use them. I don't use buds. And on top of which, there's the question of compression, which we notice when we've been forced to edit over Zoom recently because we can't meet. And we've noticed, for instance, and this is a real question when it comes to how things are compressed, both in terms of MP3s, which a lot of people are listening on MP3s, the compression for a number of the streaming platforms, which differ in various particulars, which, for instance, will push bass frequencies up into the higher level, which means that, for instance, if you are editing out, a distant noise of a door closing, you have to be really careful that you really edit it out. Otherwise, it will find its way, even the real deep bass frequencies out. Otherwise, the compression will push those back up into the middle of the sound picture. But the corollary to this is, I remember another engineer saying to me, well, it's all very well having the noise of that truck there, except that somebody's listening to it on really big speakers. The noise of that truck there, which won't be audible on the small speakers, will make their speakers start to walk across the floor. It's this kind of, we're constantly having this conversation. Which do you aim for? I don't think I know the answer, but it's something to juggle with. I'd like to do a little bit of a sidebar as how we can approach this question of sound and environment in a creative way. I would say that the people who've been most helpful with regard to this, for me, have been composers. And what's really fascinating is that every single composer will have a different conception of how the sound world of their pieces works internally, the dialogue between the parts. Then the next thing of how that will be witnessed from outside. And the third thing, the environment that the whole thing takes place in. Now, of course, these things necessarily rotate in on each other, but they are separate from each other. And they're also linked a little bit to the way the notion of the composer themselves sees the nature of their score. So the nature of the score could be expressed in one way, in terms of the way, for instance, that a composer might see the ictus of a chord. So a composer like John McCabe wanted the ictus of a chord to be very precisely expressed. He had a very particular idea about the relationship between the entry of a piano and strings on the front of a chord, and was very demanding of that in editing. And just from acceding to his demands, which were exhausting, taught me a huge amount about his notion of what his sound world was. That fed back into my work as a performer. But if you think about this in terms of the relationship between the internal balance of something and the disposition of the players, other composers, for instance, have a more disparate idea. So a composer like Michael Finnessy will prefer the feeling that the players are communicating, but they're communicating over a bit of distance, that they should be spread out for each other, that they should have to reach for each other. And if I riffle through in my mind a variety of different composers who I've worked with closely on recordings, all of them have a different idea of what the internal dialogues should be between players. Whether it's, for instance, someone like Gloria Coates, who wants a kind of granitic knit together of all of the parts. Whilst they each have their individual life, they overlayer each other, not unlike, say, the strata of a rock face. They're tightly limbed in with each other. Or a composer such as David Matthews is very concerned that there should be a kind of sparking energy between all of the parts, that he's not very interested in fact, very few composers are interested in the notion of a blended sound. In fact, the word blend is something that, in my experience, has never come up in a conversation with the composer. The next question is how the music is witnessed. Now, this might sound a little strange, but every composer will have a different notion of from what distance or lack of distance, a little bit like what Bryony was saying earlier, the music should be witnessed as a ideal. So the American composer Michael Hirsch wants his music to be witnessed at quite some distance, to the consternation of recording engineers who try and explain to him that if the microphone is 20 feet back, you aren't going to hear anything. But no, there's an idea there of to how it is viewed. Just as much as, right now you're witnessing this with the sound of fireworks outside. It's, in many ways, it's the question of how the world finds its way into the music. But really at the center of all this is the question of how an environment is being created. Now, the British composer Edward Carey is particularly interesting in this because he sees a direct correlation between the environment of the music itself, both in terms of the broadest sense, but also of animals in the environment. And, for instance, the position of players within a chamber group, for instance, he regards as not unlike, say, birds in a forest who are in different places in the forest, who may or may not be communicating, but each have their own environments in which they exist. In fact, he would use the word habitats about him. Now, the reason I'm bringing him up is very interesting, is because in order for this to work, he demands that his music should exist in quite extreme resonant space. Quite often he will talk about his music needing to sound as if it's in a cave or a forest. One of the reasons is because he has found that the gestures that he's used, if they are played into harsh and acoustic, will sound modernist in a way he doesn't want them to. Just as much as if you were to transcribe the song of a blackbird and you were to play it exactly back in a dry studio, it will sound, to be honest, it will sound harsh and aggressive, whereas if you play it in a bit of woodland, it sounds mellifluous. So these are all things which feed into our idea of what the sound picture should be. Now, to wind up, I want to talk a little bit about the question of control. One of the reasons I'd urge you to take as much opportunity to experiment and to use the facilities here at the Academy to work with your instrument and whatever mic you can get hold of is so that you have the skills and the understanding to resolve questions when they come up in situations where you might not have control, but find that you might be able to contribute just beyond just playing. These situations might be just when you're about to record, looking where the mic is, and without criticizing someone's work, suggest it's perhaps been knocked off axis when it's been put in the wrong place, for instance, without offending anybody. Although I've experienced things which irredeemable situations, such as a televised quartet concert from Venice, where we discovered that mic had been placed underneath my cellist's chair. There's no way I could get round, saying put that in a good place. So everything was wrong. Now, very often, mid-recording in an orchestral chamber situation, there'll be mass visits to the box to listen back. And in general, you'll notice that these moments often tend to be sort of stock-taking. Each person will walk out with their part, and they'll check that they've done their part technically. And this can be very useful for a producer who can't chase everything, for instance. And I've appreciated it many times in chamber recordings when I can't be completely sure that I've followed what everybody is going to do. However, the one thing that doesn't tend to come up in these mass visits, which are less mass at the moment, is the sound question. And it should. Not so long ago, I was recording a concerto with an established orchestra and a famous producer. It struck me that the mic placement from my stand was not particularly ideal, and the large orchestra, which was not in the larger studio, meant that I, as soloist, was standing close to a wall on my right. I managed to get the mic moved into that 160 centimetres above bridge precision, which I mentioned earlier, and the engineers seemed pleased that I had an opinion. However, when I went out for a first listen where this famous producer was not producing but telling anecdotes about his other famous career, the sound was awful. It sounded like a bathroom. I raised an eyebrow and was waved down, "Don't worry, this is just the listening back sound." A month later, the finished edit arrived, and I won't bore you with the mess that had been made of the editing itself, but the sound itself was even worse. The orchestra sounded overblown, and I sounded desiccated, as if I'd been playing next to a brick wall, which, yes, I had. Now, it's at moments like this that knowing how to fix a problem from your own experience can pay dividends, and I managed to lose my temper on email enough to get the mess cleared up. Hopefully your experience and adventures with sound can help you find a way in and around similar situations.